It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the MSI MAG 274 QRF QD-E2. In the description of the video you'll find accompanying content as well as information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support. As usual for a video review, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software and by YouTube, and ultimately and very importantly it depends on the screen that you're actually viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what you'd see firsthand using the monitor. This monitor uses an IPS type panel, more specifically a BOE IPS ADS panel. This has a 27-inch screen size, 2560 by 1440 or 1440p QHD resolution, and support for up to 180 Hz. So this 27-inch screen and QHD resolution combination is quite a popular one, gives you a good pixel density, you get a decent amount of workspace, useful workspace. It also gives you decent detail levels and clarity overall, and that would include when you're observing suitably high resolution image content, and that would include games as well. So yeah, it's a pretty versatile resolution really for both work and play, and it's not super demanding on the GPU, certainly compared to high resolutions such as 4K UHD. I'm going to look now at the refresh rates supported by the monitor and some associated features. So it supports up to 180 Hz at its native resolution. This is via DisplayPort, and you can use a 10-bit signal at the same time if you wish. You can also use HDR if you want at the same time, and there's support for adaptive sync, which allows you to use technologies such as AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA G-Sync compatible. Via HDMI, you're limited to a maximum of 144 Hz and 8 bits per channel. You can use HDR at the same time if you wish. Adaptive sync is supported, which will allow you to use AMD FreeSync, but there's no support for NVIDIA G-Sync compatible. The monitor doesn't have HDMI 2.1, it has HDMI 2.0, so that means there's no HDMI 2.1 VRR, which would allow you to use NVIDIA G-Sync compatible. It would also allow you to use VRR on the PS5, so there's no support for PS5 VRR on this model. If you want to use a 10-bit signal via HDMI, then you would have to run at 60 Hz or below at the native resolution. Via HDMI, there is also a 4K UHD downsampling mode, which will allow the monitor to receive a 4K UHD signal at up to 60 Hz. This is to improve compatibility with games consoles primarily. For example, the Xbox Series X would only allow an HDR signal using the 4K UHD resolution. I'm on Battlefield 5. I'd like to briefly explore the scaling capabilities of the monitor. I'm running it at the native resolution at the moment, 2560 by 1440. I'm now running the full HD resolution at 144 Hz. You have to select 144 Hz or below to use the monitor's scaling or an interpolation process on the monitor. You can use GPU scaling at high refresh rates if you want. And I'd say in terms of the overall quality on this monitor, it's roughly on par whether using the monitor or GPU scaling. So there's a moderate amount of softening compared to viewing a native full HD monitor of this size. But there is a sharpness control in image which you can increase. You can increase this all the way up to 5 if you really want to, but I'd say that really gives a very weird over-sharpened look to the image. But a more modest adjustment here of up to 2, maybe even 3, I'd say that offsets the softening pretty well. I'm not saying it looks exactly the same as a 27-inch Full HD native monitor, but it's quite usable now, and I think it will offer a sort of sharpness level which most people will be quite happy enough with for the Full HD resolution on a screen of this size. So overall a pretty good interpolation process for the Full HD resolution here. There's an additional sharpness control if you wanted to fine-tune things further or use it instead of the sharpness control, and that's in Professional. It's called Image Enhancement. I've just reset the sharpness to the default of 0 by the way, just so I can look at image enhancement on its own. So if you set this to weak, it's a slightly different filter to the sharpness. Actually weak, it's okay, it's kind of a little bit weaker in terms of its sharpening effect, I'd say, than setting it up to 3 for the sharpness. But by the time you get to medium, it over-sharpens things quite a lot. So I've set the image enhancement to weak and the sharpness to 1, and now things look a bit on the over-sharpened side for my liking. I prefer to just set the sharpness to 3 without the image enhancement setting, but it gives a bit of a different look to things. So there's quite good flexibility on this monitor in terms of adjusting the sharpness for its non-native resolutions. You could do that with the native resolution as well, but really the neutral sharpness is more appropriate there. There's also a screen size setting, so auto allows it to use interpolation and will fill up the screen the best it can. We can also enforce various other aspect ratios as the 4:3 setting, 16:9, which will be the same for this resolution, as it's full HD 16:9, same as the native of the monitor, so it fills up the screen. But if you're using a different resolution, then you can enforce 16:9 aspect ratio there as well. And as 1:1, that's a 1:1 pixel mapping feature, which will only use the pixels called for by the source resolution. And it gives you a black border for the unused pixels, as you can see here. So this is an undistorted full HD image in the middle of the screen, surrounded by unused black pixels. I'm now going to take a look at the external features of the monitor. So the monitor has a plastic construction, dark matte plastics used throughout. I'd say the overall build quality is reasonable. You know, it has a bit of wobble to it. It doesn't feel super expensive or premium, because indeed it isn't, nor does it feel super flimsy or cheap, so it's somewhere between those two. The top and side bezels are dual stage, so there is a slim panel border flush with the rest of the screen, as well as a thin hard plastic outer part. So that panel border blends in well when the screen is switched off. It's clearer when the screen is switched on, as you'll see throughout the review. The screen surface is what I would classify as a medium or relatively light matte anti-glare finish, so it offers strong glare handling. You can see that it diffuses the light quite heavily across the screen surface, so that avoids having too many sharper glare patches. Even with fairly strong direct light striking the screen surface, you're not too likely to get sharper glare patches. It's diffused more heavily across the screen. And I also explore the consequences to the image quality of all of this a little bit later on. There's a cable tidy loop at the bottom of the stand neck, little hexagonal design there. The stand is fully adjustable, so you can tilt the screen backwards and forwards, swivel it left and right. You can pivot it clockwise into portrait, and you can adjust the height. So at the lowest stand height, reasonably close to the desk, and that's the highest stand height. So you get 130mm or 5.12 inches of height adjustment. The depth of the stand as well, it's not too much of a desk depth hog. It's a little bit below 200mm deep, so that's a little bit below 8 inches. At the rear, again, mainly dark matte plastic. Little glossy element there for the MSI logo. Red plastic used here for the OSD control joystick. There's also an RGB LED lighting feature here. And this is what the RGB LED lighting feature looks like switched on. Yes, it's in a dark room. You can see it from the rear, if you can see the rear of the screen. But it really doesn't cast much of a light at all on the rear wall. Certainly can't be used as a bias light feature. And it can't really be seen or appreciated at all from the front of the screen. The stand attaches centrally via 75x75mm VESA mounting, and if you unscrew it or you don't attach it in the first place, you will find that there are 4 holes which you can use in the 75x75mm pattern for alternative VESA mounting. The ports face downwards. You've got a DC power input, so there's an external power brick. There's a 3.5mm headphone jack, 2 HDMI 2.0 ports, DisplayPort 1.4. You've got USB-C, which has 65 watts of power delivery, DisplayPort alt mode, and upstream data capability. You've then got a Type B upstream port and 2 USB 3.0 ports. So the monitor does have 2 upstream capable USB ports, and it has KVM functionality, which allows you to easily reassign peripherals and switch the display between multiple systems, specifically 2 different systems. And you can control that using the OSD shortcut keys, or the Navi key system as they call it, so it's very easy to switch between the 2 sources. Looking now quickly at the subpixels of the monitor, there's a standard RGB stripe layout. Nothing weird going on here, so there are no issues with fringing. This is the default expected by Windows, and you don't have to worry about special optimizations with ClearType or other fringing issues from non-standard subpixel layouts. You may still wish to run through the ClearType wizard and adjust according to your own preferences though. Moving on to the calibration now. Various different settings are shown in this table that are tested. Central average gamma readings are shown. They were taken using an X-Rite i1 Display Pro Plus, which is now marketed as a Calibrite Color Checker Display Plus. There were white point readings given, and they were taken using a Datacolor Spider X Elite Colorimeter. So you can see with all of the tested settings, gamma is a bit below my usual 2.2 target, my preferred 2.2 target. So out of the box it's 2.04, and the white point sits at 6692K, which is a little bit on the cool side compared to my usual 6500K target. And I also said their green weakness because the green channel was a little weak compared to the red and the blue. This wasn't a massive weakness, by the way, it was just a slight imbalance which the colorimeter picked up on. The Pro Mode settings are color space emulation settings, so it will emulate sRGB, Adobe RGB and Display P3 or DCI P3. so it will clamp the colour gamut closer to those particular colour spaces with those settings. These provided a warmer look to the image, close to 6000K for the white point with all of those. I also like to explore low blue light settings briefly. So there are two ways of doing that on this monitor. You can use the low blue light setting. So that is an effective low blue light setting. Significantly reduces the blue light output from the monitor, especially if you're also reducing the brightness. But I prefer setting the colour temperature to warm to achieve this, which gave 5071K, so slightly warmer, quite similar in terms of its effectiveness as a low blue light setting, but it gives a warm amber tint to the image, whereas the low blue light setting maintains a strong green channel and gives a bit of a greenish yellow tint to the image, which I don't really like very much. So if you like to use these kind of settings, perhaps for relaxing evening viewing, then I would strongly suggest trying out the colour temperature warm setting instead of the main low blue light setting. With colour temperature set to customization, which keeps everything in the neutral position for the colour channels, 8215K, so very much on the cool tinted side there. These are my test settings. I didn't quite get 6500K, I got 6434K, which is close enough. But as I mentioned in the best settings video, the colour channel adjustments are a little bit imprecise on this monitor. So if I bumped that one higher, I would have got close to 6600K, so completely overshooting my target. It doesn't really matter for general purpose use of the monitor, and if you're using your own colorimeter or similar device, that can help further fine-tune things if you need to. And in the second table there, it has the setup I used. This is explored in more detail in the best settings video. Various little adjustments I made there, for example, reducing the brightness. Set the response time to fast. I used the user setting as the mode, and I made some adjustments to the colour channels. I reduced the blue channel specifically to 42. As noted there, individual units and preferences vary, and these won't be optimal in all cases. There are some ICC profiles in the description of the video if you wish to try them out. One was created using the test settings, and the other using Pro Mode sRGB with everything else at the factory defaults. As noted there, the ICC profiles are not used in the review. I'm going to look at the gamma in a bit more detail now. This is using my test settings, but it was similar with the out-of-the-box factory defaults with the user setting. And you can see that at all brightness levels, so that's shown at the bottom on the x-axis, percentage of grey, it was below the 2.2 target. For the dark shades, it sits a bit below 2.1. So that means there isn't a heavy uplift of dark detail. There's not a heavy unmasking of dark detail, which would happen if your gamma was significantly lower there. So that's good, because that gives an unnatural uplift to the image, which I really don't like to see. That's avoided, which is good. The gamma tracking generally sits between 2.0 and 2.1 for most other shades. It does drop lower for bright shades, so it's close to 1.9 there. That means that some bright shades are over brightened and therefore they blend in a little bit too much into white. That doesn't have a clear effect on the image if you're just casually observing the monitor or anything like that. For image editing, it could be an issue. Although for image editing, I would suggest, even if my unit was pretty well calibrated with respect to gamma, you would get the best results actually calibrating with your own colorimeter or similar device if you can. This graph here, that shows the gamma using the sRGB setting. The gamma tracking now more closely approximates the sRGB gamma curve rather than the 2.2 gamma curve. So for those who aren't familiar with sRGB gamma tracking, gamma is purposely reduced for dark shades, but it otherwise should be tracking close to 2.2. And that gives an uplift to dark detail, brightens up those darker shades other than black, but it still remains above a gamma of 1.8. If this was true sRGB gamma tracking, the gamma would actually fall below 1.8. And you can see that for the bright shades, there isn't that kind of obvious dip in gamma. It's actually corrected. And for the very bright shades, it comes close to 2.2, actually just slightly above that. Sort of an overall comment on the gamma tracking on this monitor. Of course, it's not perfect. It doesn't track the 2.2 curve correctly, or the sRGB curve for the sRGB setting, if that's what you want to go for. But thinking about my test settings, it certainly doesn't give a washed out look to the image. And actually using the full native gamut, things are pretty vibrant, pretty punchy. It does mean that various shades are slightly less deep than they should be, and it can actually give a touch of extra pop in places, lifting up certain shades a bit. So again, for general purpose use, I think many people are actually going to quite like this representation, really. It's not something I'd worry about. Switching the attention over to the sRGB colour accuracy now, so this is using the sRGB emulation setting, and this is the Spider Checker 24 test patch pattern. As usual, shade 1F cerulean is the highest. If you've watched my reviews before, this will come as no surprise. This is often the highest error. The colorimeter seems to be particularly sensitive to the balance of blue versus green for this shade. Monitors often get that a little bit wrong. But elsewhere, pretty decent performance really. Average delta E 1.27, nothing to be sniffed at. But it's really for these blue biased shades where the highest errors are occurring, where it's approaching a delta E of 2 for shade 6F, which is a royal blue, and for the blue shade 2G, It's slightly exceeding a delta E of 2, so a bit higher than average. And if you recall earlier in the table, and I showed you the white point of this setting, it was close to 6000K rather than 6500K, so that can certainly account for quite a few of the inaccuracies I'm observing here. But again, even with this, decent overall accuracy. And of course, some units will be more tightly calibrated than mine. I don't think they will all be set to 6000K white point for the sRGB setting. You cannot adjust the color channels on the monitor using this setting though. It is restricted in that respect. I'm now going to focus on the contrast and brightness performance of the monitor. So this table here shows white luminance and black luminance values recorded using the X-Rite i1 Display Pro Plus colorimeter, now marketed as a Calibrite Color Checker Display Plus, and also the calculated static contrast ratio using those values. So the maximum recorded here was using color temperature customization at 511 nits, so that's nice and bright. Pretty close to that using the factory defaults with user setting but set to 100% brightness, so 495 nits there. If you use the eco mode, at 0 and 100% brightness it's the same, but it changes the brightness mapping, so for values between that it will edge towards a lower brightness most of the time. So for example, at 50% brightness using the user setting I got 303 nits, whereas using the eco setting it was 234 nits. But the contrast ratio generally sits close to 1400 to 1, which is good for an IPS type panel. It drops a little bit using the emulation setting, so it's close to 1300 to 1, and using my test settings it was also slightly exceeded 1300 to 1. But that's still a good showing for an IPS type panel, especially when you consider the adjustments I made to the color channels, which does drop the contrast ratio a bit. It's also worth noting if you're using the sRGB setting or one of the other emulation settings, your maximum brightness is lower than using the full native gamut with the user setting. So instead of being close to 500 nits, it's below 400 nits now. So a maximum of 388 nits using the sRGB setting. That's still bright enough for most people. The overall brightness adjustment range of this monitor is really good if you look at the 54 nits minimum and 511 nits maximum. That's a really good brightness adjustment range. Most people are going to set their monitor somewhere between 100 and 200 nits. There's some variation in preference either side of this. The minimum isn't super low, but it's low enough for most people. Even reasonably sensitive users should find this okay. And for those who like their monitor to be pretty bright, this monitor does go pretty bright. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance using some in-game examples. So with its IPS type panel, contrast sitting around 1300 to 1 under my test settings, this isn't an amazing contrast ratio by any means. If you compare this to a VA panel and certainly an OLED, you don't get that same kind of inkiness and depth on this monitor. There's also IPS glow to consider. You can see that towards the corners of the screen. From a normal viewing position, you'd probably be sitting a little bit higher up. So you tend to see that more readily towards the bottom corners of the screen. It just appears as a sort of cool silverish sheen on this model. And this is really a moderate level of IPS glow, an expected average really level of IPS glow, but it does eat away at the atmosphere and detail towards the areas of the screen that it affects. So I mean, yeah, you do get an edge still when you compare this to some IPS models in terms of the depth and the inkiness, if you like, and just the depth to medium shades as well. Got a bit of an edge here compared to some models which will fall below 1000 to 1 for the static contrast. But still, if you're sitting in a dark room as I am now, do not expect a spectacular experience. I've now brightened the room up quite a bit. It is moderately bright now. Still controlled lighting conditions, so I'm not in an uncontrolled lighting environment. But this is just to show you that if you are sitting in a brighter lighting environment, then it does take your eyes off the weaknesses with the IPS type panel. And really, the weaknesses you're observing now, the sort of greying on the screen, that's not so much the monitor as it is the glare striking the matte screen surface and being diffused fairly heavily across the surface. As I noted earlier, this monitor has a medium or relatively light matte anti-glare finish. So it's quite strong in terms of its glare handling, and that means it does diffuse light pretty heavily across the screen surface. And that does haze up the image, as just a scattering the diffusion of light across the surface will do that. It doesn't give so many of the sharper glare patches that you would get on a lighter matte screen surface, and certainly on a glossy screen surface where you would get sharp, almost mirror-like reflections in places. So I've got some direct light striking the screen surface now there just to show you the sort of diffusion of glare which you can expect. And when I observe brighter shades, there isn't a clear graininess to the screen surface, there isn't obvious layering, there isn't obvious graininess, it's not smeary in its appearance. This is what I would consider quite a light misty graininess. So I'm very sensitive to this, so yes, I do still notice it, but I think most people are going to be pretty happy with this level of graininess. I've certainly seen quite a few grainier matte screen surfaces in this particular class, so for 27-inch QHD models. So I think all things considered, the glare handling characteristics which let you use this monitor in a pretty broad range of lighting environments and still have it in quite a usable state. And in terms of the reasonable level of graininess, yeah, I think it's going to be pretty agreeable for most people. I'm on lagom.nl, the website, and the tests for viewing angles, and I'm going to look at the colour consistency of the monitor. Now, the way this is represented on the screen is a bit weird. It looks like there's a sort of bright blue patch up there. I can't see that to my eye, so maybe it's just the angle of the camera. The camera's picking up something weird there and exaggerating something weird there. But anyway, that aside, the overall colour consistency here is good. The text looks pretty well blended overall. There is an orange tint towards the bottom and a slight greenish tint towards the top with the striping of the text, but there aren't clear flashes between saturated green, saturated red and orange at different sections of the screen. They're much more subtle tints than that. So this indicates a low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor, as you'd expect from an IPS type model. This particular shade always looks really bizarre on the camera. There isn't an obvious pink blob in the middle of the screen surrounded by purple. It actually looks a pinkish purple throughout the screen. It does have less of a pink hue, so more of a bluish purple towards the extreme edges of the screen. And that is exaggerated if you sit closer to the monitor and less apparent sitting further from the monitor. I tend to sit with my eyes around 70 centimeters from the monitor. And from that kind of distance, this is certainly a minor feature. The red block appears quite a consistent rich red throughout the screen. A little bit deeper towards the extreme edges of the screen and particularly towards the corners. If you sit close enough to the screen, you see a sort of vignetting effect, but from my preferred viewing position around 70 centimeters from the screen, or even a little bit closer, this is really quite mild or very difficult to spot. The green block appears a saturated green chartreuse shade throughout, quite consistent, no complaints with this one. Again, if you sit close enough to the monitor, you may observe some inconsistencies, but from a regular viewing position, not a problem. And the blue block appears a good rich royal blue throughout the screen. I'm now on Battlefield 2042 and I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction using some in-game examples. So again, pretty strong colour consistency helps the monitor maintain its vibrancy and richness throughout the screen, which is just generally nice to see, including when you're playing games. On monitors like this, which have a colour gamut which natively extends far beyond sRGB, you're observing content like this game running under SDR, other games running under SDR, you're just on the desktop, you're watching movie content. That kind of content is designed with the sRGB colour space in mind, so using a native gamut which extends far beyond sRGB will give you extra pop, extra saturation, oversaturation in other words. And that's definitely a feature here. So the native gamut of this monitor, I measured 99% DCI-P3 coverage, and for those interested, 91% Adobe RGB. You can see with this gamut here, it actually extends with a bit of a skew towards the red to blue edge. So some QD LED displays, they will show greater coverage in the green to blue region, so that includes cyan shades, and that will give greater Adobe RGB coverage than I recorded here at 91%. But with the extension here for some blue shades and pink shades, and also some reds, it's quite something. So with this rather generous colour gamut, definitely a lot of vibrancy, there's a lot of pop to the sky blues, and the greens as well. They don't look quite as neon as they do on some models which have greater Adobe RGB coverage than this, but there's certainly a lot of pop to them. They look brighter in general than they should within the confines of the sRGB colour space. And there aren't any very good examples here. Well, actually the fires look very rich and vibrant, with oranges verging a bit too much on a reddish orange and some yellows verging too much on sort of orangey yellows as well. I was going to say though, there are some pinks I've seen in games which are really eye-catching on this monitor, bright pinks and also reddish purples and some saturated blue shades as well, not just the sky blues. They're really very eye-catching indeed. If you want to tone all of this down, you want to see things more as the developers intend, you could change to the sRGB setting. So that one's Pro Mode sRGB on this monitor. I don't know what was with the excited inflection in my voice there, but never mind. So this tones things down, and the sky blue's more of a greyish blue, more toned down as it should be. The same with the green shades. And I didn't specifically mention it, but there's often a reddish tint to earthy browns on this monitor, and also skin tones can look a bit pinkish or overly red, overly tanned, or potentially a bit sunburnt. and that's toned down as well using the sRGB setting. The same with these fires as well. They look more neutral, more as they should, but not as vibrant. And with the sRGB setting, the gamut now covers 96% sRGB, so there is some sRGB undercoverage, whereas there wasn't before, but that's quite common for an sRGB emulation setting. But you can see there's very little extension of the gamut beyond sRGB now. So this is a good representation of the sRGB colour space overall. You can adjust the brightness with this setting. You can't adjust the contrast, and you can't adjust the colour temperature, so you can't adjust the colour channels. And as I noted earlier, my unit sat close to 6000K, so a bit on the warm side using this setting. If you want something between the native gamut of the monitor and this sRGB setting, so you don't want to clamp things all the way to sRGB, there are other options as well. So there's Adobe RGB, and this gives what I would describe as quite a cartoonish look to things. It gives quite a skew. It maintains a lot of over coverage for the green to blue edge, which includes the cyan shades, and that does make the sky blues pop quite a lot and actually makes them sort of skewed towards this, as I said, more cartoonish look really. It's the best way I can describe it. Not to the extent of a monitor which fully covers Adobe RGB, but still stands out in a noticeable way. And the green shades as well. Some of these greens are way brighter than they should be. The leaves here, for example, again, you could describe them as a bit cartoonish, perhaps a bit kind of cartoon nuclear in places, some of the patches of grass as well. And there's a bit of an orange push to the earthy browns as well. Not a reddish push now, but an orangey push. The colour gamut now, using this setting, I recorded 91% Adobe RGB, which is exactly the same as using the native gamut of the monitor, but you don't get extension beyond, so it clamps the gamut elsewhere as it should, closer to Adobe RGB, without much, if any, real overextension. Last but not least, there's Display P3. I'm just going to show you the colour gamut now. This extends to 95% DCI P3, so there is some loss compared to the native gamut, which covered 99% DCI P3, so it's a little bit overzealous, you might say, with its clamping, but it again does a good job at minimising overextension beyond the target gamut. So with this setting, really it looks like a bit of a toned down version of the native gamut. So it gets rid of some of the oversaturation, but there's still a lot, especially for the red biased shades as well. There's a lot of bias towards red for the oranges and yellows and red shades for the fire there, for example. Sky blues have a fair bit of pop still, and the greens toned down a bit compared to natively. So various different looks you can go for if you like. Just switch back over to my preferred test settings using the full native gamut. And if you're using this monitor for colour accurate work, then it is useful having these sRGB, Adobe RGB and DCI P3 emulation settings as a general point. But as I noted, you do sometimes lose some of the gamut compared to using the native gamut of the monitor. If you really want to get the most out of the monitor in terms of colour accuracy, I'd recommend using the full native gamut and using your own colorimeter or similar device to make corrections after you've corrected the colour channels as best you can on the monitor itself. And that will give you the best colour gamut coverage and also make various other corrections. But if that's not an option for you, it is still nice to have these emulation settings. It would of course be nice to have colour channel adjustments available when you're using these emulation settings, and ideally you would have no less coverage than you'd have using the native gamut of the monitor for a particular colour space. That was at least the case with Adobe RGB, but if you are working a lot within the Adobe RGB colour space, just be aware that 91% Adobe RGB is not complete coverage. You will be missing out on some of the most saturated shades there, but it's still decent coverage of that colour space, and certainly 99% DCI P3 coverage is very strong for work within that colour space. And again, the fairly strong colour consistency is helpful if you're using the monitor for colour accurate work. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider running the game under HDR, and I'm going to have a brief, and I do mean brief, because it's not very exciting or good on this monitor, look at the HDR experience. The monitor is VESA Display HDR 400 certified, which is the lowest level of certification you can get for the VESA certifications. Basically, under HDR, the monitor doesn't have any local dimming, so the backlight just stays at a level which is similar to the maximum you will get under SDR. So it's basically like having the monitor at 100% brightness, no local dimming, the whole backlight dimmed as one single unit, or not dimmed as the case is here. So the brightness is now 515 nits for pure white. And the colour temperature, because you can't adjust the colour channels, that sits, or at least it did on my unit, around 6200K, so it does have a slightly warm tint. I explore some of the adjustments you could make under HDR in the best settings video, so I'm not going to go through them here. You do have a little bit of control. You can make things look worse than they already do by changing the preset to something else. Again, refer to the best settings video if you want to look at more about that. But you're able to see in the video quite clearly, there's not the kind of depth you would expect to really medium or dark shades. There's no local dimming going on, there's not even any dynamic contrast going on either, so even if there's a lot of dark shade or medium to dark shade as there is here displayed on the screen, the backlight doesn't dim at all. So you have your IPS glow, which is fully visible. I should have mentioned as well actually the contrast section with respect to IPS glow. It is more significant if you use a higher brightness setting on the monitor, as is used under HDR, and also if you sit closer to the monitor, or if your unit has issues with backlight bleed or clouding. Mine is actually quite good in that respect, but it does vary between individual units. Either way, with the static contrast sitting around 1400 to 1 here and no local dimming, there's just no depth and atmosphere here. Jumping into the water, what I like to see in this scene, or ideally like to see, good variety of closely matching bright shades. 10-bit colour reproduction helps smooth out the gradients. You do still get 10-bit colour reproduction used here, but without it having semblance of proper dimming precision, no local dimming in other words, it just can't accentuate this advantage properly at all. And also the actual brightness of the brightest shades displayed, so the sun there again, it's only going to max out at 515 nits in the best case, and I'm not saying this is quite the best case, but it's just not the kind of brightness you would get from a much stronger HDR performer. And there's also not the contrast there, so the water surrounding the sun there, it's not even as deep as it should be, some of those shades, and the shadow detail up there isn't very impressive either. I'm going to quickly just talk about colour reproduction, and this monitor has quite good potential in this respect because it has such a generous colour gamut, 99% DCI-P3. So remember, under HDR, the developers can target wider colour spaces such as DCI-P3 and ultimately Rec 2020, which this monitor offers decent coverage of as well, but not full coverage of. Very wide colour space, that is, with Rec 2020. So basically, the developers can target these wider colour spaces rather than targeting sRGB, and things can be mapped nicely. But in this case, they aren't really mapped nicely because there is definite oversaturation. So things look pretty vibrant, and some people like that, and if you do like that, then, well, you'll get that here with the level of saturation. But there's a lot of extra pop to these green shades, and again, they look overly bright, a bit like they do under SDR. It's toned down somewhat compared to that, but there's still a lot of extra saturation. The water also looks a tad too blue, a little bit overdone, but actually not too bad for these particular shades. And also Laura's skin looks a little bit more sun-kissed than it should. And just a general observation, not just on this scene, I have certainly seen some overdone reds and oranges, which verge too heavily on red under HDR, and some overly bright, almost neon-looking greens as well. So yeah, these green shades, I suppose you could describe them as neon, but some other green shades I've observed elsewhere are even worse than this in that respect. So not really natural looking. So I don't really want to spend more time on this section. I think you get the gist. You do not buy this monitor for HDR. Do not buy this monitor expecting HDR to look good or anything resembling real HDR. Having said that, you know, it gives a different look to things, and you can use it for a bit of variety on the side. I'm on Battlefield 5 now, and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor has a 180Hz refresh rate, so you're getting up to 3 times as much visual information outputted every second as a 60Hz monitor, or this monitor running at 60 frames a second or 60 Hz. And that brings with it 2 main advantages. It greatly enhances the connected feel, and that is the precision and the fluidity you feel when you're interacting with the game world or your character on the game. This is also something which is aided by low input lag, which this monitor also offers. I measured 1.85 milliseconds of input lag on this monitor, so it's a good low level. The other advantage to this high frame rate, high refresh rate combination is that it decreases the perceived blur due to eye movement. There's an article on the website exploring responsiveness and some of the terms I'm using here in more detail if you're interested. But basically, perceived blur that you observe on a monitor is contributed to by the movement of your own eyes, and that's tightly linked to the refresh rate of the display, assuming that you're matching that with your frame rate. And also the pixel responses of the monitor, they play an important role. So there's a method called pursuit photography which is explored in that article. Many of you will be familiar with this anyway, using test UFO motion test for ghosting. And I'm going to show you some pursuit photographs on the screen with the monitor running at 180Hz. So there are 3 different overdrive settings, or response time settings on this monitor: normal, fast and fastest. I consider fast to be optimal at 180Hz. There's also a reference display which actually uses the same panel as this, or the same cell as this. This uses a different backlight, in other words, but the rest of the panel's the same. And that is why the performance is very similar. And I use this as a reference because this is a level of performance which many people are very happy with indeed and won't have any issues with. They'll be perfectly happy to game on a monitor with this kind of pixel responsiveness. So you can see, if you look back at the shots for this monitor, the MSI, the normal setting has quite a bit of powdery trailing, particularly for the top row, which is the dark background, and this is reduced when you go up to the fast setting. It's eliminated pretty much with the fastest setting, but it's replaced with overshoot, so you can see that kind of inky trailing behind it. In practice, this overshoot is a bit brighter for some transitions than is shown here, and I found it too eye-catching. So I again prefer fast. I consider this optimal. For those of you preferring response time figures, here are some figures. These are using the normal overdrive setting, so the lowest overdrive setting on the monitor, in other words. And these figures, be careful if you cross-compare them with other reviews, because other reviewers will use their own methodology and their own instruments to measure this, so there can be some disparity between the figures measured. I use the OSRTT Pro tool, the same tool and the same methodology used by TFT Central, although they will use their own color coding system. And basically, the performance here is sort of okay, but not great for 180 Hz. There's no overshoot, but if you look at the response times, they're not particularly fast. So what's being measured in the response time table there, initial response time, the average initial time is 6.26 milliseconds. Bumping up to the fast setting, it does speed up quite a few of these transitions, and you're now getting a more competent performance for 180 Hz. And average initial time is reduced to 4.9 milliseconds, which is certainly an improvement. There is a bit of RGB overshoot observed, but really not very much of this. It's really quite isolated and by no means extreme overshoot. So in other words, it's certainly worth going from normal to fast, and I do consider this a competent performance for 180 Hz. Ideally, you would have had a bit more acceleration used for some of the transitions. You know, you get the maximum value there of 10.4 milliseconds. I do feel that a little bit of acceleration could be used. Maybe it would have given too much overshoot, or more visible overshoot, because it starts from black than the manufacturer wanted, or maybe there's another reason they didn't do that. But either way, I would have liked to have seen slightly better performance for these particular shades, but it's still a good performance overall. It's really up there with other modern fast IPS models. If you bump up the response time to fastest, then you get a lot more overshoot. You can see that straight away. A lot of red in the graph, too much in my opinion. Although the average initial time now drops to 3.26 milliseconds. However, the sort of slowest transitions, they remain rather similar. So in other words, it doesn't do much to the slowest transitions, but it does speed up the other transitions and speeds them up a lot and gives a lot of overshoot. Not a visual compromise, which I think is worth making. So what this means in practice, I don't observe any eye-catching overshoot, which is nice, and the general performance is good for a 180 Hz LCD. It's much better than you'd see on your typical 180 Hz VA panel, and again, it's really up there with fast IPS models on what I saw with the ViewSonic VX2728J-2K, for example. There are some, the slight weaknesses. They're not major weaknesses. They're not enough to give smeary trailing or anything like that. Just a bit of powdery trailing in places, for example, with the very dark shade against the medium background there. And just some of the little intricate details, the mixtures of dark and lighter shades. But even on the fastest IPS models I've seen, there'll be a bit of this going on. It's really only on OLED monitors that I've used where you won't see slight weaknesses, a little bit of a mask of powdery trailing for these kind of transitions. On another scene on Battlefield 5, this one has higher contrast transitions for many of the transitions, so that's to say that there are some very dark shades against much brighter backgrounds and vice versa. So here you are seeing some of the weakest transitions, which I measured before, some of them up to sort of 10 milliseconds, although most of them aren't quite that slow. So yeah, you do get a bit of powdery trailing, and it's not too heavy really, even for the sort of worst case transitions. So you'd see with the makeshift roof here against the bright sky in the background. Some of the slowest transitions the monitor performs are observed here, and even there, not extreme weaknesses. So I think the overall experience here is certainly one that most people are going to be very happy with. The monitor also supports VRR, variable refresh rate technologies. You can use NVIDIA G-Sync compatible, and you can use AMD FreeSync. It does not support HDMI 2.1 VRR, as there's no HDMI 2.1 capability on the monitor, so you cannot use VRR on the PS5, for example. But the range of operation on this one, it's stated at 48 to 180 Hz, although the 48 Hz floor of operation isn't an exact thing. It can change depending on the fluctuations in frame rate which are occurring. This tends to happen more, I find, on NVIDIA GPUs than on the AMD side. They sometimes have a floor of operation of closer to 55 Hz rather than 48, but it doesn't really matter too much. It just means that LFC, low frame rate compensation, kicks in, and with that you would get the frame rate sticking to a multiple of the refresh rate rather than sticking to the exact refresh rate. So if the game's running at 30 frames a second, the monitor could be setting itself to 60 Hz, for example, and that keeps tearing and stuttering at bay in much the same way as the main VRR operation of the monitor does. I didn't observe any VRR flickering on this monitor. That's not an issue. It's not typically an issue with IPS models, but I'd just like to confirm that that wasn't an issue on this one. When you pass the LFC boundary, there is a subtle momentary stuttering. It's not as obvious as the stuttering you get when you're not using VRR, but if you're particularly sensitive to it, you might notice it. If you're frequently passing the LFC boundary, it's something you may pick up on. But most of the time, you'll just be crossing this boundary occasionally or staying either side of it. So I've got the monitor running at 120 Hz. The game's running at 120 frames a second, so it's matching that with its refresh rate. And I'm still using my preferred fast overdrive setting. And overall, a competent performance here. Good pixel responses. There's a little bit more overshoot than there was at 180 Hz, but nothing particularly eye-catching or obtrusive here. So yeah, pretty solid 120 Hz performance. So let's back that up with some objective assessment. So here are the same test UFO pursuit photographs shown at 120 Hz now that were shown earlier at 180 Hz. And again, the reference screen, the ViewSonic VX2728J-2K, shown for comparison. Very similar between the ViewSonic and the MSI when you set the MSI to its fast setting. And that is to say that there isn't a lot of powdery trailing behind the UFOs, and there's nothing really to complain about in the way of overshoot for these transitions. If you set the monitor to fastest at 120 Hz, it doesn't actually make a huge difference. It does just sort of side more towards overshoot, and it speeds up some of the transitions. The normal setting, on the other hand, is just generally a bit too slow, even for 120 Hz. And now to look at some figures, which really reinforces a lot of what I've just said. So with the normal setting, average initial time 5.86 milliseconds. Not too bad for 120 Hz, but could be better. There's no overshoot here. Bumping up to the fast setting, you can now see some overshoot in places. Not an extreme amount, but it is there for some transitions. And I was observing some of that overshoot in the scene I was showing you before, but nothing too extreme again. But the average initial time has now dropped from 5.86 to 4.38 milliseconds, which is a good improvement. This is a competent 120 Hz performance now. If you bump up to the fastest setting, the average initial time doesn't really change much. It goes from 4.38 milliseconds to 4.24 milliseconds, and there's just a bit more overshoot. Again, really reflecting what I observed with the UFO motion test for ghosting. So down to 60 Hz, it's a bit of a rude awakening in some respects. So the connected field is much worse now, just because of the lower frame rate and refresh rate, and also it's just a lot more perceived blur due to eye movement. The pixel responses, well, I can see that pretty snappy, but there's also a definite increase in overshoot now. You can hopefully see some of that on the video around the makeshift roof there, bright halo trailing, which is brighter than the background even, so it does stand out. It's not extreme overshoot, but if you are sensitive to overshoot, you might find this bothersome and you might want to switch to the normal setting. So I've just done that, and that does get rid of the overshoot. The pixel responses are a bit slower in places now, but it's still quite a decent performance really for 60 Hz. There aren't any particularly egregiously slow response times here. So this does mean I can't consider this a single overdrive mode experience because I would use fast most of the time, but if I'm dropping close to 60 frames a second or 60 Hz on the monitor, then I would want to drop to the normal response time setting. But that's just for my own sensitivities. Some people would happily use fast all the time. There are also a few caveats with this, or a few things to be aware of. Just remember, I'm talking about a VRR environment here, so if you're not using VRR and your game is running at 60 frames a second, the monitor will not change its refresh rate, it won't lower its refresh rate, and you'll get the performance more like what I was showing you before at high refresh rates. The other thing is that if you're having the monitor set to a static 60 Hz refresh rate, it actually will give you less overshoot using the fast setting than I've shown you here under VRR. So the tuning's a bit of an oddity. I would have preferred to have seen more consistency and some form of effective variable overdrive used under VRR so that I don't have to change the setting to normal. And the point at which you might want to change between the fast and the normal setting, it's very individual, but roughly speaking, I would say if I was spending a lot of time with double-digit frame rates, I'd probably side towards normal, whereas if I'm spending a lot of time in the triple digits, towards fast. So let's add some objective data into the mix to make this a bit clearer. So again, using the fast setting, which I consider optimal at 60 Hz at a static 60 Hz refresh rate, which is what is being shown here. There's not really a problem with overshoot here. Good performance, pretty similar overall to the reference screen. Fastest does introduce a bit of overshoot. It doesn't introduce a massive amount of overshoot at a static 60 Hz. And normal, again, is a bit slower, but not super slow. The response time figures are similar if you're using VRR or not using VRR, and at 120 Hz, incidentally, regardless of the response time setting used. Similar performance using VRR versus a static 120 Hz, which is why I didn't measure or cover the differences there. They're really not worth exploring. So the normal setting here, whether you're using VRR or static, pretty similar. 6.57 milliseconds average initial time, no recorded overshoot, so reasonable 60 Hz performance here. The fast setting, this is where things get a bit complicated because it depends whether you're running at a static 60 Hz or you're using VRR. So static is shown at the top, VRR 60 Hz shown at the bottom. And you'll see that basically the tuning's better at a static 60 Hz refresh rate. You have an average initial time of 4.9 milliseconds, whereas under VRR it's 4.62 milliseconds. Not really a huge difference, a bit faster with VRR, but not massively so, and not enough to really account for the extra overshoot you get under VRR. So with a static 60 Hz refresh rate, a little bit of sort of golden green on the graph for overshoot, which isn't really particularly high, whereas using VRR you get some red and some orange for most of the transitions recorded here. Now the fastest response time setting is a bit of an interesting one. So this is similar whether you're using VRR or a static 60 Hz refresh rate. And you will see straight away, or the observant amongst you will see, that actually the overshoot's lower now than it was under VRR 60 Hz using the fast setting, which is a bit confusing. But what I would say is, in practice, if you're sensitive to overshoot, I would still side towards normal, but the fastest setting could be worth using over fast, assuming your unit is configured like mine is, because fastest does show less overshoot, although at the same time, some of the transitions are a little bit slower, because the average initial time is 5.07 milliseconds, rather than 4.62 to 4.9 milliseconds. So I again consider normal optimal, but you might have to have a play. It's just a shame that either way, if you did like fastest but didn't like fast, it's still not a single overdrive mode experience, because you're probably going to find fastest introduces too much overshoot as your refresh rate increases into those triple digits. So a bit of an awkward one. I would have much preferred to have fast as a single overdrive mode experience. That isn't offered here, but even so, fast is good for most of the range, and some people will find it okay even at 60 Hz. This monitor also has a strobe backlight setting, MPRT, and that can be used with a refresh rate of 120, 144, 165 or 180 Hz. So I'm just showing you 120 Hz, the lowest available, and 180 Hz here. The other refresh rates between them are really visually somewhere between what I'm showing you here as well. With this setting, there is definite improvement in clarity to the main object compared to not using the setting. And you can see that with the comparison here at 120 Hz and 180 Hz. So using the fast overdrive setting without MPRT versus using MPRT, where you cannot configure the overdrive setting incidentally. There is some strobe crosstalk, so that's the broad term given to trailing behind or potentially in front of the UFO. It's a bit stronger at 180 Hz because the pixel responses are slower, whereas at 120 Hz it's a bit weaker, but there can be some stronger overshoot in places as well. Not for these particular transitions, although there's a little bit of overshoot. But the clarity with 180 Hz MPRT, really, it's overall very good, and the strobe crosstalk is still fainter than the main object. This graphic here that shows the monitor set to 180 Hz using MPRT, and it shows how the strobe crosstalk varies at different points of the screen. At other refresh rates, it's broadly similar in terms of the position of the strobe crosstalk, so I'm not going to explore them here. But what you can see is in the middle of the screen, and that's where your eyes will mainly be focusing, particularly when you're playing first-person shooters, which are the sort of games where this kind of setting is usually most appreciated. The strobe crosstalk levels are not too bad, but further up the screen, you get quite a bit of strobe crosstalk in front of the image, and it sort of melds into it almost. It's nearly as bold as the main object. Quite bold strobe crosstalk, can be quite noticeable. And lower down, you get that same kind of thing behind the UFO. And actually it becomes very bold really low down the screen. So, as I said, mainly your eyes will be focusing centrally when you're playing FPS games, but the higher or lower down strobe crosstalk for strategy games or games with scrolling text further up or down the screen, and combat flight simulators, that kind of game where you'll be shifting your eyes across the screen, various different points a lot, then the strobe crosstalk could be more annoying there. Final few things to note about this mode. There aren't any KSF phosphors used on the backlight because it uses a QD LED solution, and these are extremely common KSF phosphors for wide gamut LCDs, so it's nice that they're avoiding using them here. And these can give colourful flashes of various colours, including red and magenta. And you can also get similar fringes, red and magenta fringes, to the edges of objects. And what a member of my forum very cleverly described as red fringe cringe. I really like that term. So these visual distractions, they're annoying. I'm quite sensitive to them. I really find them annoying on monitors with KSF phosphors, so I'm pleased to see there aren't any kind of artifacts like that here. But as usual for a strobe backlight setting, there is a flickering as the backlight strobes at a frequency matching the refresh rate of the display. Sensitivity to such flickering varies, but there's more potential for this to be bothersome at lower refresh rates. Some other limitations to be aware of. The brightness is locked using the MPRT setting, and it's locked to a brightness of around 260 nits, so that's pretty bright. It's going to be too bright for some people, and potentially not bright enough for others. Either way, it's nicer to be able to change the brightness, but you can't change it here. And this isn't MPRT sync, so you can't use VRR at the same time. You really do need your frame rate to match that refresh rate for the best experience, or potentially be extremely high, then that could also work. So it remains a bit of a niche feature, really. It's not something which everyone's going to want to use. In fact, most people are going to just want to use regular VRR on this monitor. But at least this is sort of a fairly usable and reasonably well-tuned strobe backlight setting for those who like that kind of thing. To wrap up then, good ergonomically flexible monitor with decent build quality. It offers quite a strong contrast experience for the panel type. I was pleased to see around 1400 to 1 or 1301 with my test settings. Pretty good for the panel type, but not amazing. Still an IPS type experience there. The screen surface didn't have a horrible amount of graininess to it either. Reasonably smooth representation and good glare handling. I think many people are going to be quite happy with this screen surface as well. The colour reproduction, certainly on the vibrant side, nice generous colour gamut. Good for colour critical work within multiple colour spaces, definitely DCI-P3. Pretty good but not perfect Adobe RGB coverage as well. Good colour consistency from the panel as well. Only quite minor weaknesses in that respect, although it does depend on viewing distance. If you're sitting closer to the monitor, then these shifts become more exaggerated. And I did like to see multiple emulation settings included for different colour spaces. Can just give a different look to things and can be useful for accurate work within those colour spaces as well, if you don't have your own colorimeter or similar device. The brightness adjustment range was also very good. It went nice and bright and also nice and dim. With this generous colour gamut, good brightness adjustment range, you might think perhaps HDR is, semi-decent on this monitor. Well, I mean, it depends what you classify as semi-decent, but in my opinion, it's not really very good HDR on this monitor. There's no local dimming, no dynamic contrast either. The backlight just stays at pretty much its maximum level all the time, which really saps a lot of depth and inkiness from dark shades. And remember that IPS glow is more significant at higher brightnesses such as this. So not really a nice experience in that respect. And on the colour side as well, there was quite a bit of oversaturation under HDR, which shouldn't really be there. Yes, there should be some good, vibrant elements where the developers want them to be, and where they should be, and where they will look in place, but there shouldn't be such residual oversaturation under HDR. It does still give a different look to things, so you can use it if you want to have a little bit of variety, but it's definitely not something I'd buy this monitor for. On the responsiveness side, mostly good things to say about that. Good low input lag, good 180Hz experience, and you could use VRR at the same time, which worked nicely as well, no VRR flickering, and also a reasonable strobe backlight setting for those who like that kind of thing, although you can't use that at the same time as VRR. My main criticism, I guess, would be that it isn't really a true single overdrive mode experience, because I consider the fast overdrive setting optimal most of the time, but at much lower refresh rates, particularly at 60Hz or approaching that, or indeed below, then I would consider the normal setting optimal. Whereas if you set the monitor to a static 60Hz, the overdrive tuning is completely different and actually pretty good using the fast setting. So I think they could have improved that. Not a massive issue. I think some people, perhaps most people, will find fast fine even at 60Hz because it doesn't have an extreme amount of overshoot, but it still isn't what I'd consider optimal there. So, I mean, this is quite a crowded space in the monitor market, really. One of the alternatives to this model, or one monitor in that space that I've recommended for quite a while, is the ViewSonic VX2728J-2K. And that was referenced a few times throughout this review. So I'll draw a quick comparison here with that one. The MSI is based around the same panel but has a different backlight, so that is to say it uses the cell version of the panel with its own separate backlight fitted. It offers USB functionality including USB-C with 65 watts of power delivery and KVM functionality with easy switching. The ViewSonic on the other hand has a more basic array of ports without USB of any type. The ViewSonic has integrated speakers. They're nothing to shout about, but at least they're there if you want to use them, whereas the MSI doesn't have any of those. The ViewSonic includes 100 by 100mm VESA mounting rather than 75 by 75mm VESA mounting, and that's used on the MSI. So many mounts will support both, but not all, so 100 by 100mm VESA as used on the ViewSonic is a bit more widely supported. The ViewSonic offers tighter 2.2 gamma tracking, whereas the MSI offers a higher peak brightness of around 500 nits rather than around 300 nits for the ViewSonic. Contrast also appears higher, peaking around 1400 to 1 on the MSI rather than 1100 to 1 on the ViewSonic. The MSI has a wider colour gamut which provides stronger vibrancy and superior coverage of DCI-P3 and Adobe RGB. And that's nice if you prefer a punchier look to general content or if you're into wide gamut content creation. In contrast, the ViewSonic covers around 95% DCI-P3 and 87% Adobe RGB. Only a few more points to cover, don't worry. The MSI also offers effective sRGB, Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 emulation, whereas the ViewSonic lacks any emulation settings. Strobe backlight setting performs better with lower central strobe crosstalk and no KSF phosphor flickering on the MSI. The MSI supports VRR at 180Hz, whereas the ViewSonic does not. It supports it at 165Hz maximum. So overall, I feel the MSI is the superior monitor, though it does come at a premium over the ViewSonic. The MSI retails at a bit under $300, whereas the ViewSonic sits closer to $200 or a bit below that. The MSI is also priced quite competitively in other regions such as Europe, where availability of the ViewSonic is a lot patchier. So the case can be made for either model really, depending on the budget, and if that's a bit flexible, I do consider the MSI the better choice. I also feel generally the MSI is a strong and quite unique offering in this segment, which I am happy to recommend. So that's really all there is to the MSI MAG 274 QRF QD E2. You'll find a link to supporting content as well as information about how you can support our work in the description of the video. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support.